She's currently pursuing her PhD in development communication from Daystar University. Her presentation will be about conceptualizing differences in media development, reinforcement between the global south and the global north. Our second presentation will be from Dr. Emily Marachter. She's the director of the Africa Policy Center at Uganda Christian University and senior lecturer in journalism and media studies. She has worked in government, research, and academia for more than 20 years. She has a special focus on media development. She's also director and columnist with the Daily Monitor, one of the leading media outlets in Uganda. Her presentation will deal with the limitations of media development through capacity building in Uganda. The third presentation will be by Ines Drews, Dr. Ines Drews. She's a postdoc at the Erich Brost Institute for International Journalism. We also saw Professor Fengler today, and one of the organizers of this workshop. She's also the program manager of our graduate school, MEDAS 21. And she holds a PhD from Hamburg University, which focused on the democratic relevance of social web practices and the handling of user comments at Deutsche Welle. Her presentation will deal with the partnerships of international media development. And then I'm also glad we have a respondent today. It's Dr. Lydia Radoli. She's a Kenyan journalist, a social researcher, and lecturer at Daystar University. She holds a PhD from Brandenburg University of Technology, Cottbus, Senftenberg. What a long name. This must be German. Her PhD focused on media, migration, and development. She's also founder of Diaspora Radio, an online media platform dedicated to changing African narratives using a transnational perspective. All right, and then maybe I introduce myself as well. I guess all of you know me from my emails. My name is Roya Zaitoni. I'm a graduate student at the graduate school MEDAS 21 from Erich Brost Institute, but my home university is Ruhr University Bochum, which is also in the west of Germany. I'm also one of the organizers of this workshop, and I'm really happy that all of you are here, and I'm really looking forward to the next 3 days and all the interesting discussions, and also get to know all of you. All right, so enough introductory notes. So we will start with Josephine. You will make the kickoff, and we have your presentation already. I give you, all of you, a sign after 10 minutes, so you come to the end of your presentation, and then we will move on.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Josephine, as you've been told. Yeah, that is my study, conceptualizing the differences in media development reinforcement between the global south and the global north. That is my study. And sorry about that. So let me say that the primary goal of my research is to understand that variation in media development support between the global south and the global north. And to begin with, as posed by Dedos and Cornell, 2012, the world's global north and global south present an alternative to the idea of globalization. And I can say that questioning the belief in an increasing uniformity of cultures and communities, much of the research in media and communication scholarship, sorry, allow me to go back. So I'm quoting from Dados and Cornell 2012. So the word global north and global south, as I've said, they present that alternative to the idea of globalization and questioning the belief in an increasing uniformity of cultures and communities. Much of the research in media and communication scholarships has looked at the global south through the lenses of the global north. And as a result of this, you find that it has resulted in that perception of global south media systems being looked at as missing, diverging from global north or the Western norms, owing to state meddling and also lack of press freedom. Now, as a result of this, the global south has always been felt as different, it has been felt as inferior when compared to the norms of the north. And this is voiced by Willis 2014. There's a technical hitch, kindly. Okay, thank you very much. So, as an introduction, let me say this. Imbalances have been an desirable companion of the media and correspondence or communications since their commencement. And we have the traditional mass communication, which have been scolded for advancing domineering interests, thinking far, and away an excess of falls in the possession of enormous modern endeavors and producing information gaps among their different audiences. This is posed by Nordicon 2018. So news coverage has brought about orientations and race segregation in newsrooms especially, as well as the acknowledgement of casual news choice, guidelines for people with great influence, overshadowing its job as a watchdog in the popular governments. And this morning, that was covered widely about media playing that watchdog role. So allow me to poise what Piketty 2014 put across, that information checks have transformed into advanced divisions, publicizing income has moved to long-range interpersonal communication spots, undermining customary news coverage, and worldwide corporate imposing business models, be it media firms and country-state media guidelines, the same. So we have the Internet of Things, which is currently what is the norm. Everything is smart. We are going for, we are talking about smartphones, and the team that was here in the morning was talking about the way we don't need the screens maybe to listen to the news, and you realize that someone is able to, access media wherever they are at any given time they want. So the Internet of Things are causing new kinds of disparity that follow the customary examples of class, orientation of people, the kind of cash that they have, and even instruction. So the objectives of my studies, these are the objectives: to examine economic approaches to inequality in media development assistance, then to explore social approaches to inequality in media development assistance, and the third objective is to determine the media and communication-centric approaches to inequality in media development assistance, and the last one is to determine the equalities and inequalities in internet distributed media. That is the digital regime in media development assistance. Now, I have used agenda setting theory, which was developed by Dr. Marcombs and Dr. Donald Shaw in the research on the 1968 official political decision. And this decision was referred to as the Chapel Hill study. So it directed this exploration. So Marcombs and Shaw found a critical relationship between what 100 Chapel Hill inhabitants showed was the main political decision point, and what the nearby news media detailed was the main issue. So Marcombs and Shaw survey the degree to which media impacts the general assessment by contrasting the conspicuousness of issues in news inclusion to mainstream the views. So as per this theory, that is the agenda setting theory, the media affects their audiences by engraving, what they should think about, rather than what they really trust, what they really believe in. Let me say that that is assuming a report is covered. If we assume that there's a report that is covered, and noticeably, it is covered severally. It is covered often. The audience will see the point as more significant. So the investigation of, the organization setting analyzes how the media endeavors to impart the watchers, the viewers, and make an order of information strength. So countries with more political clout get more media consideration, and organization setting is impacted by the media's viewpoint on issues like, governmental issues. We have the economy of a country, the kind of culture they ought to impress, among others. Then the presentation of this organization setting and free enterprise pattern communication concentrates on supported the fast development and the spread of this agenda setting theory. Now, if I look at the empirical study and the knowledge gap, Albert, the information gap theory, it's as often as possible referenced according to the social ramification of the information, and society little consideration has been paid to its hypothetical premise. So you realize that the research that has been done before has left a gap, and that is a gap that I'm trying to fill this afternoon. Now, looking at a country like Switzerland, the access to internet is as yet overwhelmed by accomplished, prosperous, youthful guys, and the hole between the individuals who have and those that don't have extended rather than limited somewhere in the range of 1997 and 2000. So there are additionally breaks in the internet access. It has been proven that those that are skilled, those that are more skilled, they tend to use internet for, to get information. They use it more effectively, and they utilize the information that they get there. So their use of the internet is information-centered as compared to those less educated or those less skilled, because many times they get entrenched, they get interested, they get entertained, they get excited by the internet's entertainment highlights, because their use of internet is not information based. Now, I have the independent variables, of course, that is obvious. We have the radio, the television, and the newspaper. And any change in that will always affect the dependent variables. You can see them there. We have improved media behavior. We have resolving conflict online, managing frustrations, maintaining that relationships with the public, amongst others. Then I also looked at the research design and the target population, and I'm planning to use the descriptive research strategy, which once utilized, it is going to incorporate the surveying of a very huge gathering on a specific point. So the data is assembled from a sample rather than the total populace. And that is Kodari, according to Kodari 2004. So the analysis would concentrate on 4 countries. This is not a research that I'm done with, so it is underway. So the analysis would concentrate on the 4 countries, 2 from the north, the global north, and 2 from the global south. And then 6 respondents from the 4 nations will be targeted. I went for the purposive sampling, which I'll employ to choose nations for this study to ensure, of course, there is equity. So 125 individuals from each country will be chosen, of course, at random. Then the study is going to utilize questionnaires, observations, schedules, and then interviews to gather information. And we're going to have 2 arrangements of surveys for academicians and scholastic would be created, as well as meeting plan for the vice chancellors. All things considered, the essential information for investigation will be accumulated from respondents through researches, individual verbal meetings, and group gatherings. So the interviewer will be searching for inside and out information in regards to the subject. So interviews will be persuasive as a development to question response. So to gather data from primary sources, structured questionnaires will be utilized. The interviews will be professors to be they are going to be completed by the researcher, who then will note their remarks, the remarks of the professors. And the researcher additionally will mention observable facts, which he will record in a perception of opinion plan. So the perceptions would be made on the ground of our university. Of course, the survey information inspected in the accompanying ways. First, of course, the information assembled is to be totally explored for fulfillment to be achieved. And then secondly, after the errors are fixed, the information would be arranged into an assortment of classifications like identities, orientations, level of instruction, and also age. At long last, the information is to be coded, handled, dissected, and arranged into diagrams, tables, the pie, graphs involving the statistical package, targets, for social sciences. That is SPSS, adaptation 21, as per the researcher's targets. The information will be coordinated into subjects and subtopics involving topical substance examination for more straightforward analysis. Now, in a conclusion, I can say that we are moving from horde to new kinds of communication gap, as indicated by strategy studies and media imbalances. And numerous parts of imbalances have endured the progress from the conventional, or that orthodox, to innovative system. For instance, proprietorship, fixation, from predominance, prevalence of few accomplishment over massive numbers of consumers, clients, orientation, inconsistencies, disparities, and information gaps, while others have diminished or blurred into significance, like admittance to data and voice. So as voiced by this researcher, Laza M., I can say that the advanced system worsens a few sorts of disparity, like the power that is shared by really modest number of worldwide entertainers or the artists in the world, while others create that algorithmic sifting and determination, huge information, exploration, survey, social scoring, similarly, that rising economic disparity influences social union. Rising media imbalances encourages and that estrangement and that distancing. So the gap widens more and more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josephine. Because the time is a bit tight, we'll continue directly with Emily and then with Ines.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. So I don't have a fancy slide like most people, so you'll bear with me. It's what teachers do when they are not very sure of their slides. So I'm presenting on I'm reflecting on limitations of media development through capacity building, and I use 4 institutions that I'm deeply involved with. I'll be drawing examples from those. And much as it's on Uganda, I expect that we can draw some lessons from them. And my presentation will basically be some personal reflection and some views from the people I interviewed. And I'll be focusing on the contributions of media development as well as challenges, which focuses on the limitations. And then I'll look at some lessons. Now, I'll start with a very small story, and it might be many people's stories, actually. So, because we need to really be sure of why do we need media development assistance all the time as the Global South. And much of our media is actually supported through media development assistance. So when I look at my own journey in academia, I think that it draws some lessons there, because I got educated up to first degree by my mother paying my fees. Then the Belgium Technical Corporation paid for my first MA, Masters in Development. And then I paid for the masters I did here at Daystar, and the Norwegians paid for my doctoral studies. The Americans paid for my doctoral research. The British paid for my advanced research course for 1 year. And the Swedes have paid for my media development for 1 year. And maybe, just maybe, the Germans will pay for my postdoc. And this kind of tells the story of media development in most of Africa. It might be in Uganda, but in most of Africa, because we get educated, we get our capacity built by funding from different agencies. And so this presentation will also be really focusing on the practical import of such, because media development, as you can see, this is all investment by different governments in me as a person, an individual. And if I leave the industry, I live with the capacity. And that's one of the challenges. So for most people, that's how it is. And the problem is that this kind of capacity building, especially in terms of training, focuses on individuals and who then have to work within very weak media systems. And the media is concentrated in very few hands in most countries, such as ourselves in Uganda. And the complex environment within which these people actually have to work. So what does it actually mean for your capacity to be built, and then you go back to work in an industry or in a media system that does not support your skill development? So the purpose of this is really to bring perspective from that kind of practice. And I draw on 4 cases, and I'll talk briefly about the 4 cases. So there's what we call a media development organization in Uganda called the Africa Center for Media Excellence. I think most of you might have actually heard about it. and they do capacity building for journalists. You know, there's this thinking, and I think Professor Levy mentioned it, that the industry is always blaming the academy, that people are not well trained, people go to the industry when they are raw, and so on. So there are many media development organizations that actually do what the academics should do. So they wait for those who have graduated, and then they start building their capacity. They train them, they give them specialized training. So ACME does that, and I sit on the board of ACME. So I have learned over the years so many things, and it's part of what has informed this. They have, in fact, done content or what we call knowledge-based training of journalists, because again, their justification is that many journalists have the know-how, but they rarely know the content, the subject matter of what to report on. So issues of, shallow reporting and so on, lack of in-depth stories. So they've done a lot of training in agriculture, business, finance, economy, education, energy, environment, just supporting journalists to get the knowledge base of such reporting. They've also, been very strong in strengthening capacity of journalists to cover public policy generally, and awarded journalists for that. So I also do, they have what they call a National Journalism Award, and I sit on that as a judge of the journalism they do. But the other organization is called Uganda Media Women's Association. That's the second case, which really started as a response of media reporting of women, negative portrayal of women, and they have been preoccupied with trying to change the landscape in terms of representation of women, and they also started a radio station called Mama FM, a community radio station called Mama FM, where they've been able to, provide alternative reporting, alternative media, and so on. But they've also done a lot of training of just equipping journalists with gender-sensitive reporting skills. Again, a lot of training, a lot of capacity building, a lot of all these things we are talking about. And the third one is the International Training Program, which is sponsored by SIDA. SIDA is the Swedish International Development Agency. And again, I was part of this program for a year, and it really just aims, its major focus is media regulation, and aims at, enlightening or exposing media leaders, regulators, social activists, and policymakers to a broad range of regulatory issues. And I think Prof did talk a bit about the environment, the kind of regulation system that is there, what is provided for, and ITP does that quite a bit. I was part of the third cohort. And lastly, there's where I work, Uganda Christian University. I was a beneficiary of a grant. They want to educate 5 PhDs and 6 MAs. And so I was part of the first cohort in 2014. So from Daystar, I went straight to University of KwaZulu-Natal, where I did my PhD. But as soon as I finished, I became the head of the Department of Journalism and Media Studies. And that meant that I also had to deal with the day-to-day issues of curriculum development, of staffing, of capacity, of everything that had to actually happen. And because Uganda Christian University is a private institution, it also means that it doesn't pay that well sometimes. So you build capacity, and then people can't actually stay. You can't sustain them. They go away because you're unable to keep them, and that's an issue of environment. So I stopped being head of that department just 3, maybe 4 months ago, and moved to my current role. Now, all of these experiences have given me ideas of what actual limitations of capacity building might actually be, and what lessons we can draw from them. And the first one is really that training and capacity building often benefit individuals rather than systems. And because those systems may not be favorable, the environment in those systems may not be favorable, then people will actually leave. So I stay not because, so out of the 5 PhDs that were trained, only 2 are left in the faculty. So yeah, and that's a huge thing, because they've spent time as a poor resourced faculty to train PhDs, and then they can't stay. So that's one limitation. The second is that even for capacity building, the kind that ACME does, a significant number of these journalists will return that have been given adequate training in oil and gas reporting, in energy reporting, in education and so on, the kind of thing beyond politics reporting that Prof was talking about. Then they go back to their newsrooms, and these newsrooms neither encourage enterprise nor invest in it. So they too get frustrated, because when you're now been given tools, you can't fit in that environment anymore. So the media itself people leave the newsroom, people who have been retooled. I know there was a lot of talk about retooling, but when people who have been retooled come back to a system that has not changed, that neither has the interest to invest nor encourage enterprise, then many of those eventually move on to start their own things and to do other things, or in other international NGOs and so on. The third limitation is that there's also generally a reluctance of media houses to invest in the training of their journalists, and maybe this applies to only Uganda. I got the impression from the earlier session that in Kenya a lot of investment actually happens, but there's a bit of reluctance in terms of media houses actually investing in training of their journalists, in Uganda at least. And so that places a big burden on media support organizations to try as much as possible to continue giving these kinds of training for journalists. In fact, I do know that ACME has often gone out of its way to even fund the telling of stories, the kind of in-depth stories that we are talking about here, because most media houses cannot afford them. And the other limitation is that there's general lack of infrastructure, and COVID-19 did expose this quite a bit in terms of how do you actually respond to emerging challenges. And so you get to work with people whose morale has really gone down. As a private university, you're not paying salaries for people because there's COVID, and then they still have to keep working and so on. So that has made retention of trained staff very tricky, and enrollment of students have also reduced, and that means that they can't really get people to deal with. But also the general inequalities between public and private universities or institutions of higher learning means that no matter how much capacity building of academics is done, I think I've said this before, much of these will not stay within those institutions. I'm pleased that I was here at Daystar maybe 8 years ago, and I still see people that I left here. So that's a good sign that the people were here, but there are also more new people, which is a good sign. But that does not happen in some contexts. So once capacity is built, then people move on to other things. The other limitation is the uncertainties about the safety of journalists, in particular, may discourage more students from actually going to programs like those. So we are talking about, and I think, again, I'll refer to the idea of saving journalists, of saving journalism as a profession, because of the circumstances around which journalists work, and I mean my doctoral research was on media, women and media, and women leave the newsroom because the circumstances within which they work is very, very poor. Their safety is not known and so on. And so pursuing a journalism career, if you're a girl in a context like that, would be a very difficult thing. And so we keep wondering that we are training as many young women as men, but it's the young men who remain in the newsroom. The young women find other things to do. They don't go to the newsroom, and that affects diversity in other ways. So in terms of lessons, so I'll just say those are the main limitations. Are we still doing fine? Okay. Now, in terms of lessons, what can we actually draw from the experiences of these 5, or let's say 4 institutions that I've looked at? I did interview their principals, so they gave me their views. And one of it is that in terms of a lesson and what can be done differently, that it is important for academia and the industry to speak to one another. And because the industry is changing so fast, it's important that these two groups actually continue speaking to each other, but also that educational institutions in particular must, as a matter of fact or course, be able to consult with the industry very regularly. Now, we have had to do a lot of curriculum review. In the time I was head of department, in about 4 years, we did 2 curriculum reviews, and we were able to infuse, changes in the industry in the curriculum from time to time. And we always argue that, the industry is changing so fast, we need to also change. So that kind of conversation needs to keep going, but also that the industry could actually benefit from some of the content expertise that comes from this training or media development institutions, because they do a lot of research. If you look at some of the programs they undertake, they do media monitoring, they do research, they do all kinds of things that maybe, even if news media organizations cannot run their own research, they have a lot that is going on from media organizations that actually benefits them in terms of decision making. And the other lesson is that training institutions must also be very intentional in terms of creating partnerships for practical training, for example, internship and retooling. The word retooling is often used, but if it's done in partnership between the industry and academic institutions, it will reduce some of the strain that media training organizations contend with, because very often they have to keep, if you know a typical media support organization, they're writing proposals every day to fund some of their activities, and that kind of strain could be reduced by just doing that. And media houses should play a much bigger role in the design of media support interventions, and that will really be helpful. Then the other is that media support organizations also should figure out ways that they can, maybe not really force, but they can ensure that media houses also put some money on the table. That it's not always running to donor X, donor B, donor what, to fund these media trainings or media capacity building programs, but can also media houses within this context actually be able to support some of the training that is needed, and training that benefits them as media organizations, news media organizations. Yes, so the last one is that there's also need to leverage digital and social media as avenues for reaching a larger constituency. Now, training journalists who are in the newsroom may not be something that media support, the people who fund these programs, see as essential, because they ask, I know from the point of view of ACME that the question is always, why are we doing programs that support private news media organizations? Because there's a limit to which we can actually support private business. So if you find a nation media group and you're training journalists that work for them, then the question is, why are you building capacity of a news media organization that is doing business, making profits, and paying its people very little? I'm not saying that Nation Media Group does that, but yeah, so those are some of the questions that are very practical and lessons we've learned from that. And we've also learned that long-term and flexible support yields the best results. In most cases, these trainings are one-off things, but we've learned that when you get a cohort which you train over a long period of time and they're able to practice, you give them a training on how to report on, let's say, urban development, and you give them time to do some practice and they come back. You kind of iterative training would be much more important. So you're not just releasing people to go to the industry. And I know that the point was being made about retooling being, something that you're doing for the journalists to be able to do more for the platforms. But in most cases, at least in our context, it doesn't translate to the journalists being paid more. It actually just adds on their workload and stresses them and so on. So those are some of the things that we think could provide lesson in terms of the changing environment that's there. Yes, we need to adapt to them, but at whose cost? Should it always be at the cost of the journalists? We've also learned that economic incentives are important to ensure that capacity building that is done is sustained. Now, if there is no economic incentive, many people will not stay even after their capacity building is done. So we have to learn from that, but most importantly, provide opportunities for continued professional development through maybe certified training and other types of capacity building. So those lessons are very, very key, and I'm ending. Thank you. Yeah, so the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, there are opportunities. There are things that capacity building in form of training and media education can do for the industry and all that. But if the environment, in terms of the structures, in terms of the policies that are there, in terms of the system within which that media organization works, or the journalist has to work, then if these do not change, no amount of capacity building will be useful. You will build capacity of a few individuals over time, they will go away, and then the media industry itself actually doesn't change. So while your aim might be to professionalize the industry, to make sure that better stories are told, to make sure that there's a critical mass of people who understand what they are doing and can tell those in-depth stories we are talking about, while that might be your aim, if the laws remain retrogressive, if the environment remains very disenabling, then we cannot really expect much. So I want to end with a story in Lindsay Mayonzo's book, where she talks about playing football in rural Zimbabwe. And sometimes it really gets to that, the experts come and they say, this is what is needed, we are going to build capacity, but if the local context doesn't change, then it's development that dies and the expert survives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. And so let's continue directly with the third presentation. And Ines, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Do I have the remote control? Or does it work? Oh. And I'll press this. It's the partnerships one. While we're looking for the presentation, I can already say good afternoon, everyone. I consider myself very lucky to be able to present my research to you today. And yeah, it will, add to the presentations we heard before. And it's going to be about partnerships of international media development. And I looked specifically into the perspective of actors on site. So we pick up topics, again, of some kind of global north, so global south interaction, and also inequalities and donors and all these things. Okay, so yeah, maybe just a little bit of a background of international media development. I mean, I'm really happy that I now have two presentators who came before me who look specifically into this topic, but it's not always that common, but it is a growing research field. So you can tell from our own graduate school, Midas 21, we are very interested in this topic, but also there were a couple of special issues who popped up, and there's also a dedicated section as part of the IAMCR looking into this whole research field. So what is actually media development? I thought, as an academic, it's always nice to provide a definition. So according to Scott, it refers to in-country and donor-led initiatives designed to develop the media sector within a specific region or country. And these efforts includes efforts aimed at promoting independence, plurality, professionalism, capacity and enabling environment, economic sustainability, media literacy, so all kinds of things that, would be desirable for a media system. Let's look a little bit at the actors who are involved in this whole field of activity. So as we have already heard from Emily, as she may be considered like a local actor who received, who benefited from media development funds, as she told us already. And the Ugandan NGO would be comparable to the ones that I put up here just as examples. That's the top one is the Mongolian Press Council. Comunicares is a South American NGO. Radio Ndeke Luka is a Central African radio stations. So that would be local actors involved in international media development. And then you have these intermediate actors who are usually international NGOs, usually also based in the global north. For example, BBC Media Action or Deutsche Welle Academy or CEDA. I have that one on my on my slide as well. Emily mentioned it before. That's an organization that you would, it's a governmental organization that would rather be considered a funder or a donor. So at the funding level, you have these governmental or intergovernmental or organizations, also USAID or Europe Aid, for example. So what I'm interested in are the arrows in this, how do you call it, graphic. So I'm really interested in what happens between these different actors. And I'm also wondering, we have been calling it international media development aid, sometimes people call it cooperation, or Emily, I think you just called it assistance. Sometimes it's also been called partnerships, but we don't actually know for sure if these terms are apt descriptions of what is going on between the different partners there. So that's also something I'm interested in, and I'm particularly interested in the perspective of those who carry out media projects locally in the context where the media sector is deemed to require this kind of external support. Just looking at my watch. At Midas 21, we're also interacting a lot with practitioners. So, sometimes within the academic realm, we have a certain style of talking, and they have a certain style of talking. And what you hear a lot among the practitioners are certain buzzwords that they say are very important if you want successful relationships between the various actors. For example, local ownership. Projects have to be owned locally. The locals have to decide what their needs are, what is actually beneficial. Trust is a big issue as well. It has been said that among the different partners, it is ideal if you nurture a certain level of trust. And participation is another of these buzzwords that is considered very relevant for projects to be successful, because the participation of those who are concerned is considered key in this case. So let's look at this a little bit more from the academic point of view. I was wondering, how can I analyze whether these buzzwords actually have a relevance on the ground, So I found actually quite a promising analytical framework which Elbers et al. Have come up with. They say that it can be useful to look into institutional logics when analyzing media or the development sector in general, because also, you can also call it the development industry. It is some kind of institution. There are processes that have been defined, and Elbers et al. Argue that it explains a lot when you look at the institutional logics guiding the development actors who are part of it. So they say, or they argue, that there are actually at the moment two competing logics. One is social transformation and the other one is managerialism. If we connect that to these different buzzwords, we can see that they are more on the social transformation side of things. Social transformation believes in the local ownership of marginalized groups. It says that relationships between the different actors need to be value-based, as opposed to maybe, based on a certain contract or have to be spelled out, and the conditions have to be spelled out. And also in terms of the roles of the different partners, participation and local engagement is key. So in terms of this, like lip service is paid to this social transformation logic. And the managerial logic rather assumes that, development can be measured, you can define certain goals, and then you just go for it and development has happened. So I was wondering, how do program managers or advisors or founders of media NGOs who work with international NGOs rate the importance of these terms or these concepts, local ownership, trust and participation? And which aspects do they consider conducive or unconducive to a successful cooperation within international media development? So I will share with you some of the results of my online survey, which I conducted last year with 54 respondents. So what I did was I approached a German organization. It's called FOME. It stands for Forum Media and Development. So German international or German NGOs are part of it, and they work with partners on site. So I asked them to distribute this online survey among their partners, and most people who responded were actually from African countries, but also from Eastern Europe, Middle East, Asia, and South America. And before I set up the survey, I also conducted some interviews just to be able to phrase the questions accordingly and make sure that it's actually relevant. So let's look at the results already. What did I find out in terms of local ownership? What you can see here is that I asked the respondents to rate certain aspects from 1 not important to 5 very important. And in terms of local ownership, I asked for 2 aspects and how they would rate them. And what you can see here is that the mean value is kind of 3 something. So local ownership aspects were considered medium important by the respondents. For example, that they can conduct projects without interference from the partners, or that they can conceptualize the projects, or that they are the driving force in conceptualizing the project, is something that they actually did not consider hugely important. You see that there's a wide variety. Some people actually also said it's less important, and in conclusion, it's medium. That's a little bit different in terms of trust. So I asked for 5 different aspects in terms of trust, and what you can see here is that in general they are higher rated. So here more people said that the mean is usually around 4, so these are rated more important than, for example, local ownership issues. And what is the most important issue about trust is that the international organization trusts that the local organization is capable of doing what they promised to do. So capability trust was a very relevant issue. Whereas, for example, goodwill trust, which are the aspects below that can rely on each other, was rated a little bit lower. Okay. In terms of participation, I looked at whether the respondents considered end results important or the process more important, because participation is actually more about the process. But here it turned out that, as you can see, the mean is also more than 4, so both aspects were considered quite important, or highly important. But both the orientation towards results and orientation towards process were important. So even though you're veering or steering towards a certain goal, you also need to have flexibility, apparently. So yeah, that's what I'm summarizing basically on this slide. And in terms of the other research question, in terms of, can you go back? Yeah, in terms of the aspects the respondents considered conducive or unconducive to successful collaborations, I also asked them for what they consider actually important when they select or when they consider working with a new international partner. And what you can see here is what was rated most important is actually that their missions match. Whereas what was surprising, or a little bit surprising to me, the lowest ratings were things like, I have met the international partner before, like there have been personal relationships, and that the organization is known among one's peers. So these personal issues didn't even play such a big role. And based on the interview, I also asked for certain aspects and how effective the respondents considered them for a successful relationship. And what you can see here is that, for example, it was rated highly important by most that the international partner is familiar with the local sensitivities and practices. We had other aspects that were a little bit more mixed. So, for example, that the staff of the international organization wants to be informed also about small things was considered kind of annoying by some, but others thought, yeah, well, it can also help, So you see that the standard deviation here is like high, and people had mixed answers. The same, or like it's quite similar in terms of creating additional paperwork, which apparently was considered like a necessary evil that everybody has to accept. So people said, yeah, it's neither bad or good. It's there apparently. But what has been considered quite negative, or to have a negative impact on the partnership, was when the staff of the partner organization had their own agenda and they just wanted to implement it on the ground. So, yeah, to conclude, I came up with these conclusion slides, but I'm just noticing that I'm already giving the conclusions away while I'm talking. So that's the findings in summary. And how do they relate then back to this analytical framework? Well, what you can see here is that there is actually among the on-site partners not one dominating logic. The picture is mixed, and yeah, even local partners find social transformation aspects key, but also managerial aspects were found salient in the study. So we can now wonder or question, why is that? Is it pragmatics? Is this how it works? Is it that they have already internalized these things? So that's something else to look into later on. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to remarks and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ines. So thanks to all the presenters again. Very interesting insights. And now I'm looking forward to have our respondent, Dr. Lydia Radoli, who will make a joint comment on all the three presentations.
So I was given an interaction with all these wonderful presentations, and I want to greet you this afternoon and welcome that we share this interaction that I found out. And you can play the slides. I have my copy here. And so I want to start with a perspective of I have to look at the critical reflections and most on the theory of media development And where I see it, I want to contextualize what has been discussed in these 3 wonderful papers into a critical thinking and sort of a futuristic view. How do we move forward if this is the state of this existing sort of context in terms of media and development? And so I start by the questioning, actually questioning the nexus on media and development, and I got these sort of framing from McLaughlin and Scott of the Governance and Social Development Resource Center, and they expose the nexus between media and development. But when they talk about development, it's about the South dichotomy, which means that the stresses for the South countries or the so-called developing countries to look at government accountability, to look at responsiveness and the state of society relationships for them to achieve the standard of development. So when I look at that alone, the problematization already suggests existing disparities between the North and the South Hemisphere, heralding an ambition to find solutions, heralding an ambition to find a balance. And my question as a respondent to this presentation, both straddling between development, capacity building, and the context of the North-South Hemisphere, my question is then, in whose hands are these solutions? In whose hands is development? Who sets the precedents? And I can also ask, who sets the agenda for development? And so this cuteness takes me to the definition, and Ines, I borrowed a definition of your paper, which also is quoted from Scott. And he identifies the relationship, the binaries, development as in-country and donor-led initiatives. And so within a specific region, and for me, the focus towards developing nations. And so the emphasis also in the definition is talking about these, what we call the buzzwords, but for me, I'm seeing also a narrative of dominance, of power, of existing narratives that are being sort of reified now and again. And so there is the call for promotion of independence, plurality, professionalism, capacity building, and so on. So that definition also just takes us to what is the frame of development? And my question here today as a respondent is, how does the media sit in the space of development? Does communication matter for development and good governance? And so we look at, where does this come from? Good governance, development, modernization paradigms that started in the 1970s and 1980s. And we see a linear flow of information. We see an emphasis on transformation of traditional societies. And I ask, what happened to the traditional societies? What happens to their cultures? What happens to their identities? How do they contribute to development? When it comes to communication structures, we see it as the need for communication, the need for a relationship between leaders and public institutions to effect change, to enable the existence of development through facets of communication. And so the role of the media in democracy should be another effort that is seen through the discourse of development. And here we can argue that without a free and plural media, essentially, which can hold governments accountable and enable and inform citizenry, then this discussion on development is not going anywhere. So let's go to the papers. We start with Josephine Dunge. And Josephine is conceptualizing the differences in media development reinforcement between the global South and North and the so-called development agenda. And so in the notions of media and development assistance, the emphasis on the digital regime, of course, it still exposes the inequalities that exist between those spaces. Even the earlier discussion, there was a lot of emphasis on the convergence of media and the new media space, but still, is the reach accessible to all these South-North dichotomy, but of course, the South. Then also there's alternative for theorization and acknowledgement of globalization. Here, there is hope, there is a gap that can be seen as creating alternatives that calls for diversification, that calls for cultures working together, collaborative efforts. So the media narrative in her paper is more so seen as creating binaries. And so I think the first presenters, and I think also the Vice Chancellor asked us, for how long are we going to cry about colonialization, for example? How long are we going to cry about we are not developed? And for me, these binaries need to be challenged. And how do we challenge the binaries? We challenge by looking at, and it's already being done by the scholars' battle of wits. The scholars in the north and the south always saying, this is the perspective that you see as the south scholar. This is the perspective of the north scholar. And so I'm seeing an entry here using collaborative discourse on development. Can we work together? Can we see these perspectives? Can you see the cultures and contexts that contribute to development and bring them on board? So there's need for new theories. And Josephine uses the agenda setting theory, and I can challenge you, Josephine, that agenda setting theory, Walter Lippmann starting in 1922, McCombs come later in 1950s. McLuhan still advances this theory in 1975. And McLuhan talks about the media as the extension of man. And that's what we see in the new media today. And so these theories should give way or should interact with other new theories like theories of globalization, for example, convergency and new media spaces. Now, Melanie was not here, so we are not going to talk about Melanie's paper, and so I talk about Emily's paper, which is a reflection on the limitations of media development through capacity building, a case of Uganda. Emily, I've worked in Uganda. I've been sort of a beneficiary of ACME's training, and we also did one with the Democratic Government Facility, supported by the European countries, media development. And so, yes, you interact with the value of capacity building. And I like the experiences that you give. And actually, if I was to sit with you, we walk the same journey of development support, even of recent, when I call them my German friends, came to support my workspace with equipment so that I can be able to, but for the context of development, so that I can be able to bring back the knowledge from Germany so that I can use it in the context of my own daily activities. But it is not bad. It is capacity building, yes, but you are calling for a realization that the space of democratic and communication context differs within the spaces of this capacity building. You are reflecting on the practical reach of the media and the development assistance through this concept of capacity building. And I would ask you, what is capacity building? That statement is haunting me right now. When I worked as a journalist and you went to these development stories and you came back with a story that has capacity building, your editor will ask you, what do you mean by capacity building? And for me, what informs your discourse, Emily, is more so the realization that there is need to look at the lessons that come out of these, the lessons that there exist an entry point, that we don't just look at capacity building, but we also look at sustainability. We also look at our self-independence in the context of accepting this capacity building. What are we putting in the building, in the development of our media spaces? And we can go on with the discussion on capacity building, because every time we have thought that there is a challenge on development, social, economic, political, we thought, can we attract donors so that we can build capacity? Can we attract donors so that we can build the capacity of training of journalists? My question is that when we are doing capacity building, does this essence of support have an influence on the ideologies of who would be journalists, the mindset of who would be journalists, and the contribution to what context of culture and development within the places of work? We have to be not vigilant, but we have to be open to discussion. Ines, I loved your paper, because you come from a context where we can deconstruct and ask the question, what is international media development? Does it enable media democracy? Is it an agenda of the so-called international developers? But then you critique this already, and you say there's need for voices, for participation, for partnerships, yeah? And of course, you talk about this local ownership as buzzword, as trust. And for me, I see a dichotomy of power again, that it is within the structures that have been put forward to be able to convince the need for this funding. And somebody said, I think in Emily's concluding remarks, was like, are you developing or are you making the experts more, developed in terms of what they are getting out of that? But however, we are realistic of the pressures resulting from this aspect of international media development. We are also realistic of the dependency models that comes out of these. So are these models solutions, or do we already have solutions? And I think when you're speaking, I was scribbling down and I was asking, what is the concern of these international media development partners that they think that this context you are going to develop do not have ideas, do not have suggestions, opinions of how they want to move forward with this development agenda? And so you suggest that development theories should be able to consider logics of social transformation. And for me, that speaks to me that these partnerships are good, this support is good, but how do you make transformations in the way you report, in the way you grow other aspects of media? And so I bring all this discourse back to our context, Africa. So we see in Africa, media practice is enshrined in the African protocols and declaration notable principles of freedom of expression. And Professor Levy here today mentioned 3 articles, 33, 34, and 35. And apparently in the Constitution of Kenya, that's where we get them. But also the African Commission of Human and People's Rights talks about this. And the role, therefore, for media development is enshrined with the idea of improving the role of the media in the African Union between the African member states. And so to set the standards and benchmarks, especially emphasis on ethics, representation of African people. It also highlights on development in social, economic, political context. I had this picture, and I was thinking about the debate, and I had a conversation with my colleague Nathan, who teaches print media, and I straddle between print and radio. And I look at this picture, and I'm like, okay, here we have legacy media. And there's a lot of reaction about the new media space and how that is challenging, and the construction that are happening. But of course, these media spaces are interrelated. And so the idea is to also consider what is happening in the media development in the South. We see that the role of the media in development is hampered by governance. We have to be realistic. We have to talk the truth. Rampant with corruption, impunity, and ethnic divisionism. Insofar, news media has the potential to support economic and social improvements in developing countries and emerging economies. Instead of serving the public and speaking the truth to power, many media may act as mouthpieces of the powerful. We have forgotten our role. If you're working in the media, sometimes this seems so. So there is a lot of repetition of rumors without verification, discrimination against minority, and the feeding on the polarization of society. As I conclude, what is the contribution then of the media theory and discourse from the development in the North? And so we see the evolution of communication for development theories that are mirrored in the terms of broader shifts of theories and the models that have changed over time. And so from post-war period, we see that development communication has come away from diffusion theory, which, by the way, is criticized for its queerness. And it calls for greater representation of voices from the South. And for me, when I step from this podium, what I'm calling more is collaborative participation, approaches to development between the global South and the global North. So there's a possible spectrum towards media development. We can emphasize on media freedom so that we can enable democratic societies. We can also look at freedom of thought and conscience or conscience and how this overlaps with the participation of public life and the right to vote, the right to stand for election. That speaks well for Kenyans this time as they look towards the campaigns. So as I conclude, We see that there is, yes, an avenue of solutions that I start by asking. But then we also see an increased commercialization of media, which is undermining a lot of media's role in development. We see new issues or emerging issues like security, terrorism, that are affecting and provoking a more stringent control from the state. And so interferences and censorship. I can mention countries, Uganda, previous election. Emily's agreeing with me. Kenyans, we have to be vigilant. Their trainings are going by the Media Council of Kenya to safeguard against that. So these medias are producing also more propaganda, especially in election reporting. So finally, if there is a need to look at the increase of social media and the concerns that it brings. In the morning, we talked about the viabilities, the potentials of social media, but we also have to talk about these sort of concerns like hate speech and political incitement. I did that on purpose so that as we live here, thinking about development, we are connecting to issues that are relevant to us. And right now, politics is such an issue. That is my response. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you really made a great comment and you got to the heart of the whole workshop we are having here. And it was really inspiring, and you raised lots of questions and points that are also like accompanying, I guess, all of our research. And yeah, we are running out of time already, but still I would like to take a bit of time for Q&As. And does anybody need water, by the way? Because I forgot. Are you all good? All right. Just making sure you are well. Yeah, please think about questions already, but before I give the microphone to you, I would give a very brief chance to all of you to make a comment about an aspect that maybe Lydia has raised. And I would start with you, Emily, maybe. Tell us what capacity building means to you.
Thank you. I must say that I really loved your response, not just to my paper, but to all of them, provoking questions, and which are quite key for further discussion on these subjects. So I think that's really, really an appropriate response. Thank you. Now, the main thing for me, because of time, I'll respond to the one, which is that what does capacity building actually mean? And I think she talked about a buzzword like participation, and capacity building is one of those. And it's an all-encompassing term that really means many things, at least in our context. It means you identify gaps that you're trying to plug, and those gaps can rest in the people in terms of the skills they have, which you plug by training. It can mean gaps in, having systems that are inadequate, which you can fill by buying equipment. It can mean, like in your case, you were given equipment, and it can mean gaps in not having funding for reporting. That means that you're funding reporters to go and tell a more deeper story of something. So it means many things, really, and I would be shy to put it as one thing or another. In the case of the UCU project that we had, it meant training more lecturers to get advanced degrees as PhDs or masters. It meant buying equipment. It meant buying books. It meant exchange programs. It meant having partners from the North come and teach on the programs we had started. It meant starting another program, a PhD program. So it means many things, really, and so capacity building becomes an appropriate word to encompass all of those. And especially where the gaps exist. It also means sometimes ideological issues, such as what does your curriculum actually have some gender-sensitive reporting? How do you ensure that your lecturers also are gender-sensitive? So retooling is part of it, including of lecturers, and so those are the many things that formed for us capacity building. Thank you.
I thank you too, Lydia, for your wonderful and very insightful and helpful remarks. So two things that struck me. I really liked how you called development a discourse, the discourse of development. And I think we should all be more aware that it might not be an actual thing out there, a necessity. It is something artificial that might be something artificial that has been that has become a certain discourse, and that's the reason why the global south tends to think, oh, we need more development, and the global north tends to think, yeah, we are pretty much developed, and we can question whether this is the case. And we see it a lot nowadays, now that, you know, in a globalized world, we are facing similar challenges all over the world, the challenges that have been mentioned this morning. Also in Germany, journalists are confronted with hate speech. Media literacy is a big issue. We have no recipe how to teach the children at school what media literacy is actually, what is it all about. Like the curricula are not yet done, you know. So these are things that I think we are all grappling with, and we can learn from one another. And but then on the other hand, as you also pointed out, there is some kind of power hierarchy. Of course, funders, as in the graphic I showed, I mean, funders have the money, so it's clear they have more power. But you were asking, in whose hands is development? And I think there is some kind of momentum right now, because also among the international media development organizations, there's a lot of thinking about decolonializing what they do. So if you want to move beyond all these, colonial stuff, I think they are also thinking, I mean, you have to grapple with it still, because now decolonializing thing is what people think about a lot. So yeah, I think who sets the agenda? The local organizations might have more leverage than they actually think, and I think they should try and make that work.
Yeah, thank you, my colleagues. And Dr. here, she has done a lot of justice to our area of concentration. Let me say that I fully agree with what she has put across, especially about the kind of theory that I was talking about, that is agenda setting theory. Now, I was looking at some of the Southern scholars that have always questioned the idea of having global South being, labeled as different and inferior, And we have also seen scholars, very critical scholars, challenging the issue of especially the international news, media, having, to import some of the Western programs that have always been, appreciated, especially in the global South. Now, when I look at some of the programs that, the Western programs that existed sometimes back in the 19th century, I was looking at, allow me to quote a very famous program, Reforman, that was in the 19th century. It was actually propagating violence. But when you look at one that was just, exported the other day, that is yellow, it's referred to as, I think, yellow ground or something. It still talks about violence, talking about the Jackson family taking care of a ranch and a lot of conflicts, from the West. That is in America, of course. A lot of conflicts from the landowners, those that want to invest and everything. And that is what we love watching. So when you look at the kind of impact it has on us, because I think belonging to the global South, I think the best we can do is to come to that communication discourse where at least we can impress what is going to work for us and what is going to take us to the other level, instead of just having to challenge what is everything that comes from the global North, because ideally so much good has
been exported from the global north. Thank you very much.
All right. Is it working? Okay. We have 4 o'clock already, but nevertheless, I would take another 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Eric?
Thank you so much, the presenters, for those wonderful presentations. I was halfway falling asleep, but I was getting interested in how the conversation was deeply engaging. I think what I observed across the board is some lack of clarity in the papers in terms of the object of analysis, which the subject could be clear, but the object of analysis presents a problematic understanding of the methodological implications of the study. For example, in some studies, you find somebody talking about non-random sampling, random sampling, but implying a non-random technique, which are surveys, you know? Those are problematic issues. I also saw problems in the general, because the general discourse coming around here is informed from the subject of development, which is usually contentious. Let me stand. Development is usually contentious because development lays stake to underdevelopment. So for development to exist, it must, first of all, create a space of comparison so that it can other that space for it to qualify as more developed than the other. These are colonial epistemological positions, positionality, subjective positions of power. But yet, that is not coming out quite clearly in the papers if you want to reflect from the tradition of Africacentrism. If you want to adopt a combative decolonial literature or an approach to what you want to argue, even as you want to envision embracing some level of cultural compromise, where you want to accept that from what the respondent talked about, you know, to your papers, you want to really qualify the Western position as equally important and embrace it to some extent, because these are binary systems of knowledge. No one is more important than the other one. Yet that kind of conceptualization is lacking through and through. For example, if you take a paper that still talks about agenda setting in 2022, then we have a problem. Because agenda settings are informed from bullet theories and theories of the 40s that assumed that media audiences are less intelligent. And we've moved from questions of agenda setting to questions of questioning reality and discourses, ideological realities that are born out of discourses that are constructed either through framing and representation. So if you get people who are inspecting things to do with development support, where is the object of analysis? Who are you going to approach for your answers? And how sure are you with the methods that you're choosing that they are merely just responding to chase you away because people don't like interviews nowadays, or they are taking it deeply into their hearts and they want to tell you the truth about what you are inquiring? Because at the end of the day, it's questions of reality and questions of the truth. We are seeking knowledge, but knowledge is the truth. So who is going to tell you the truth? So methodological questions are arising out of those kinds of gaps. So I would want to see those papers reflect on the position that you want to adopt, and those positions should clearly guide or lead the paper, those theoretical positions. And these are epistemic positions. They are not just positions. They are positions informed by also your strong conviction as a scholar and how you've seen others making a case for what you're studying. And therefore, that will guide you towards your methodological approaches to to the kind of conclusions that you might want to adopt. And I think that's the most important connection. If you miss the opportunity to get the kind of response that you want from the respondents, then you're clearly going to make misguided conclusions. Thank you very much.
Let's collect 3 questions, and we make the respondents. And the rest of the questions, let's keep it for the tea break afterwards or for the dinner tonight. I think we have lots of issues to discuss now, but very little time. But yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I would like to thank all the presenters for the good work. And one thing really intrigued me, a statement: development dies and the expert survives. That was by Dr. Emily. So based on that concept, you talked of capacity building becoming useful for the individuals and not the systems. So the question is, how can we make this capacity building benefit both the individuals and the systems? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I must start by appreciating the work of the presenters, and of course the response also did a lot of justice to the work. And I think I want indeed to agree with the presenters that it is an issue of power dichotomy that we're talking about, the global north and the global south. And of course we must also underscore the fact that the cultures are differing, and for that matter, the North, having been civilized a little bit early, the South we are always lamenting, and also having been colonized, we're still complaining. And I think we need to have a mind shift towards the fact that how do we really also reach to that extent whereby also we're not going just to be importing, but we're also going to be exporting lots and lots of ideas. And case in point, as we've been complaining that the Western media and how it covers Africa, how we portrayed, of course, and we really complain about it. Another thing that possibly I would wish to comment about is the freedom of the media in the North and in the South. And of course, there is very different perspective in the North and what we have in the South. In the South, for example, in Kenya, we can agree that the freedom of the media is there in theory as opposed to in practice. And of course, we can give examples. We mentioned about Uganda and the elections that were there. In Kenya also, we are just a step away from an authoritarian system, because in 2017, we had also issues where the media houses were censored and they were not working for several days. So I think from where we sit also, we really must ensure that our media is going to be as independent as possible and as free as possible, and also cure some of the laws. And possibly from the Kenyan perspective, we still have some laws that are also outdated, but we are not also talking about them. So that possibly if we update them to the extent that they are fair on the media houses and the journalists, we're going to make strides to the extent that now we are going to compare to the global north. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I would like to make a last round, and but please keep it short, and we can discuss it more in depth afterwards or at the dinner. Who would like to start? Emily.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking everyone who has asked a question, and I will start with the methodological issue that was raised by Professor Ogenga. I'll speak for myself and let the others speak for themselves. I presented a paper that was reflective, that was reflecting on practice, and I was not trying to do any theoretical analysis of this. I was actually just trying to draw from practice, and that's why I used a case study approach where I used 4 cases. So in those 4 cases, I only interviewed the principals, the people, but also remember I have been part of these institutions, all 4 of them, and a decision maker in all of them. So that's where the basis of my reflection comes from. And I wanted to keep it practical and real. That's one. The second thing, somebody asked about how can we actually ensure that this system doesn't just benefit individuals, that capacity building doesn't benefit individuals alone, but also the systems. And there are many ways. I think as I went through some of the lessons, I tried to draw on some of them. And one is that we need to also see how do we conceptualize capacity building in terms of the issue of sustainability. That's where I was drawing on examples from Can Media Houses also put some money on the table. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but this paper was also motivated by the suspension of the DGF, the Democratic Governance Facility that you're talking about. And it happens that in both organizations, Uganda Media Association, Women's Association, and ACME, where I sit as a board member, they were the biggest sponsor of our programs. And that means for over a year now, we have stalled programs. And so that for us calls for the question of, to what extent do we actually want to depend on the global north for activities we are convinced are important for building capacity of journalists and local news media organizations. So for me, that is where the system comes into play. Are we also building capacity of, it's not, I'm a beneficiary, it's not a bad thing for an individual to benefit. The individual is part of the system, but because the logic of most tech corporations is that you can't support the system. You as the local organization must also be providing some 15% or 20%, in which case, in most cases, they don't even have that anyway. So if the system only allows for project-based activities, that you're going to do 2 trainings and this is going to be the result and so on, then it doesn't leave room for the strengthening of the system within which these people actually operate. And I think we need to shift and start thinking of how do such corporations actually move beyond just the individual, so that when the individual leaves, there's a stronger system within which other people also can come and operate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for their remarks. Again, I found Professor Radioli's remarks very helpful. I'm not really sure. The presentation as such was supposed to be 10 to 15 minutes, so it has to be a snapshot. But apart from the sweeping statement that it's problematic, I would be interested in knowing more details about your critique, Frederick. So what I did and what I experienced when I conducted the interviews and conducted the survey, especially with the interviews, I did not feel that my interviewees were tired of talking and did not want to be researched. In actual fact, they were happy to be asked about these things for the very first time, to be able to reflect on them, and I had a feeling that they really also needed to vent something here and there. I tried to combine this with a more quantitative approach to be also provide a little bit more of systematic knowledge on this issue, which hasn't been researched a lot so far. Of course, if you want to have an epistemological discussion about this, I don't think there is any actual objective truth out there. I would subscribe to social constructivism, and that's why I try to not take any of these definitions and concepts for granted and try to look behind them on the basis of the data I collect.
Yeah, thank you very much. As a parting shot, let me say that we ought to ensure that everything is not put far away from the media scrutiny, because from our presentations, it's very clear that many times it depends on who is doing what.
there's still a lot of control from the government. And as much as we're exporting these ideologies and everything, you realize that the media, that scrutiny is not done well, and that margin of the cultures is yet to be impressed. So I think we need to come to a place whereby we can merge, what is going to work for us, what is going to work for everyone, and what is going to accommodate every person, regardless of their race, regardless of their class, regardless of what they do and their position, especially in the government. Thank you.
Lydia, you also have the chance to have the last word of this
I have
panel.
the chance to give you my parting shot. And I think for me, I really appreciate the comments that have been made by Professor in terms of interrogating, scrutinizing the processes, structures of methodologies, because again, this is a platform where we improve the work that we are doing and we learn from the discussions that are happening here. For me, I want to move forward, to make a transition from the discussion, from concepts and theory, and ask about the question of do we see the value of these concepts and theory, and how we can then relate that to link that to the reality, and that is the beginning of social transformations that we are talking about, not just in the context discussed here, but generally in the media frames, whether the media is in the North Hemisphere or in the South. I think if we go back to, and we cannot run away from theory, we go back to the theories of how the media is established, and the roles of the media, agenda setter, watchdog, and all those that we can list. I think the idea was there to have an institution that can be overseer of society. And I see that the solutions that we seek, and the morning was more so seeing the gaps and challenges and problems, and the solutions that we seek through research and discussion sort of just lead us to make that possible in reality of practice. And that is what I'm seeing from this discussion. Having said that, I think it's a very useful discussion that needs to continue beyond here. Thank you.
All right. So thanks again for all of our presenters and our respondents. Maybe we can clap for them. Yes, it was really inspiring, and I close this panel now, and looking forward to more discussions afterwards. And before we leave for the tea break, I think we have some organizational issues, right? Jeremiah, are you in charge of this? You might have also seen in the program there was a little slot for a welcome session. We skipped it because the time schedule got a bit changed a bit. So we will continue with some welcoming notes before the dinner tonight. So Jeremiah, I pass the mic to you.
Thank you, and I think you can move to the other side of the audience. Thanks so much for those wonderful presentations. Has it been a great day? Has it been a great day? Quite informative. The late Professor Ken Waribora, in a small book called Siku Njema, it's a Swahili novel, said that it pushes this perspective that the only constant is change. And as I feel in one of the areas where we really feel change is in the media. We are here talking about disruptions, and when we have these changes, they also come with challenges. The DVC today was telling us about the technological and social disruptions, which are pushing us to relearn, and the need for us to throw out the old script and adopt a faster speed. The VC, Professor Iro, told us that we need to assemble adequate knowledge, and that we need to be a continent of uploaders, not just downloaders. And then Honorable Pogisho told us that we need to think of ourselves whether we continue chasing the discipline when it has already moved on. I just thought I will pick on those few to say that today has really been a great day, and we have 2 more full days that have scheduled engagements and interactions, just like what we have had so far. We have a few things that we thought we need to mention to you. One, we have tea that is has been set up for us already. I come from a religion that really values tea. So we have tea where we had our lunch. So kindly, let's go and have that tea so that it can also energize us as we prepare for later in the evening. Then after the tea, we have dinner that the organizers have coordinated for us at Pan-African Hotel. This is actually an opportunity for us to network, for us to interact, and for us to get to know each other more. I really urge on all of us, after here and after we are done with the tea, let's just move to Pan-African Hotel and let's have some wonderful time there together. We have great food that has been prepared for us, and it's promising that we're going to have good conversations. And those conversations will not be there if you miss out. So kindly make sure that you're available for that dinner. Then tomorrow in the morning, we felt, given that we are just having conversations as academia, it's important for us to move out and see what is actually happening in the media houses. So we have coordinated 2 visits, one to Nation Media Group and another one to the Standard Group. However, we are having challenges with one of the media organizations in trying to farm it up. And so I would kindly request you let us affirm and confirm who will be going to which media house during the dinner time, because there's some bit of detail that we need to confirm from one of the media houses. The conduct has been held up, and we need to be sure if we say we meet at 7:30, where we are heading to. So kindly, we'll pass that information in terms of where we'll be, to which media house you'll be going to. We'll pass that information during the dinner. In case you're not picked to go to any of those 2 selected media houses, because it's only a small portion of us who go there, you can spend the morning hours relaxing, enjoying Nairobi, and then we meet here at 12:30 for lunch tomorrow. Lunch has already been set up, has been prepared for you. So in case you will not be selected to join any of the groups that will be going to the 2 media houses, let's meet here at exactly 12:30 for lunch. And then after lunch, we have scheduled the second session of the presentations, which will be talking about media innovations and media economics, which also promises to be such a great interaction. We have papers and presentations that are being prepared for you. So let's come and consume that. So from here, we go have the tea, and after the tea, all of us by 6 p.m., let us assemble at Pan-African Hotel. In case you don't know where that is, you can talk to me when we're having tea, and I'll be able to guide you appropriately. Or in case maybe you're having any challenges on how you want to get there, I can maybe either give you directions or assist you in making sure that you get to that location. I want to thank each one of you for this great day that we've had, and say that we look forward to 2 more great days. Thank you, and let's go have the tea, and then after that we go to Pan-African for our dinner together. Karibuni. At Pan-African, yes, there is enough parking for cars at Pan-African Hotel. Let's go for the tea.